He was only a boy when it happened, standing quietly beside his mother while laughter filled the marble hallway of that mansion. The rich family didn't just refuse help that day, they humiliated them, mocking their worn clothes, their trembling voices, and the desperation in their eyes. That single moment burned itself into his memory, shaping his silence, his anger, and his determination. Years later, the same town would see a man return not in rags, not in shame, but with a presence so powerful that no one could ignore him. This is not just a story about wealth and poverty, it's a story about dignity, patience, and how time has a way of turning pain into purpose. As the past collides with the present, one family will be forced to confront the consequences of their cruelty, and one son will finally decide whether revenge or grace defines who he has become. He came back to the city on a rainy evening, the kind that made the streets shine like broken mirrors and washed memories to the surface. Whether you wanted them or not, years ago, this same city had watched him leave with his head down, and his heart shattered after his poor family had been publicly humiliated by one of the richest families in town. Back then, he was just a quiet teenage boy standing beside his parents, listening as cruel laughter echoed through a grand hall where wealth decided who mattered and who didn't. Tonight, as his bus rolled past glittering buildings and expensive cars, he was no longer that helpless boy. He carried silence like armor, and inside him lived a calm determination shaped by years of struggle, sacrifice, and a promise he had made to himself when no one else was listening. He rented a small room near the edge of town, nothing fancy, just a bed, a table, and a window that looked out onto an alley. It suited him perfectly. From there, he began to observe. The rich family that had once humiliated his own was still powerful, still admired, still untouchable in the eyes of the city. Their business empire had grown, their name mentioned with respect and envy. People spoke about them as if money had erased every wrong they had ever committed. But he remembered the details no one else cared about, the way his father's hands trembled as he was mocked, the way his mother held back tears to protect her children, the way the crowd stayed silent because wealth had taught them to. Those memories were the fire that had driven him for years, pushing him through sleepless nights, endless work, and moments when giving up would have been easier. During the day, he kept a low profile, working a regular job that gave no hint of his true intentions or abilities. At night, he studied files, articles, and public records, piecing together a clear picture of how the powerful family operated. He wasn't planning reckless revenge driven by rage. He was planning something far more dangerous, truth exposed at the right moment, consequences delivered without mercy. He had learned patience from poverty and discipline from survival. Every move he made was deliberate, every step measured. This was not about destroying for the sake of destruction, it was about balance. About showing the city that power built on humiliation and cruelty was never as solid as it appeared. Sometimes he walked past the old neighborhood where he had grown up. The houses were smaller than he remembered, the streets narrower, but the emotions hit just as hard. He stopped in front of the place where his family's home once stood before they were forced to leave. The memory of packing their lives into boxes while neighbors watched in silence still burned in his chest. He clenched his fists, not in anger this time, but in resolve. His parents had taught him dignity even when they had nothing, and that lesson had stayed with him. He wasn't here to scream or demand apologies. He was here to let actions speak in a language the rich family understood better than words. One afternoon, he finally saw them up close again. The rich family's son stepped out of a luxury car, surrounded by people eager to please him, laughing confidently, unaware of the quiet figure watching from across the street. For a brief moment, the past and present collided, the humiliation, the laughter, The pain, it all came rushing back, but instead of losing control, he felt something unexpected: clarity. The boy who had once looked down on him hadn't changed. He was still careless, still blind to the consequences of his actions, and that weakness, he realized, was exactly what would bring everything crashing down as night fell. He returned to his small room and sat in silence, the city humming outside. He thought of his parents, of the sacrifices they had made, of the shame that was never theirs to carry, but had been forced upon them anyway. He whispered a quiet promise. Not of revenge fueled by hate, but of justice shaped by patience. The rich family believed the past was buried, forgotten beneath layers of success and money. They believed the poor family they once humiliated no longer mattered. They were wrong, and soon the entire city would learn that the one thing they had missed all those years ago was the son they had underestimated, the son who had come back, not to beg, but to change everything. He returned to the city quietly, without announcements or attention, arriving on a late-night bus that stopped 2 streets away from the old neighborhood. Years had passed since the day his family was humiliated in front of half the town. Yet the memory still lived inside him, like a scar that refused to fade. As he stepped onto the cracked sidewalk, the smell of dust and street food mixed with memories of a childhood marked by struggle, dignity, and silent endurance. This was the same place where his father had once bowed his head in shame, not because he was weak, but because he had no choice. The rich family had made sure everyone saw it. He walked past the small house where he had grown up, its paint peeling, the gate rusted but still standing. His mother had tried her best to keep it clean, to make it feel like a home even when money was scarce. He remembered nights when there was barely enough food, yet his parents never complained. They taught him respect, patience, and the belief that hard work would eventually speak louder than insults. That belief had carried him far from this place, through years of relentless effort. Long nights and sacrifices no one here ever noticed. The city had changed. But the power balance hadn't. The rich family still owned businesses, properties, and influence. Their name was spoken with admiration and fear, just as it had been years ago. As he passed a cafe, he overheard 2 men talking about them, praising their generosity at public events, calling them pillars of the community. He almost laughed. People rarely saw what happened behind closed doors, or what it cost the poor to survive under the shadow of such wealth. He stopped near the old marketplace, the same place where everything had gone wrong. The memory hit him without warning. His father standing there, accused unfairly of theft. Surrounded by onlookers who chose silence over truth, he remembered how the rich family's son had smirked, how security guards had pushed his father to the ground, how no one stepped forward to help. He had been young then, powerless, clenching his fists while tears burned his eyes. That moment had changed him forever. Now, standing in the same spot as a grown man, he felt something different. Not rage control. He had learned that anger without direction was useless over the years. He had built something quietly, patiently, without seeking validation. He had studied, worked, failed, and tried again, moving from city to city, job to job, until opportunity finally met preparation. People respected him now, not because of where he came from, but because of what he had become. He checked into a modest hotel under a different name. He wasn't here to announce his return. He wanted to observe, to understand how the rich family operated now, who they trusted, and what cracks existed beneath their polished image. Power always left traces, and arrogance always created blind spots. He spent days blending into the background, attending public events, visiting offices, listening more than speaking. Each conversation added another piece to the puzzle. One evening, he attended a charity gala hosted by the same rich family. He wore a simple but elegant suit, Nothing flashy, nothing that drew attention. No one recognized him. Why would they? To them, he was just another face in the crowd, another nobody. As he watched them smile for cameras and speak about kindness and opportunity, he felt a quiet resolve strengthen inside him. They had built their reputation on generosity, but he knew how fragile reputations could be when truth surfaced at the wrong time. He didn't want revenge in the way people expected. He didn't want public humiliation or dramatic confrontations. He wanted something. Deeper accountability. He wanted the world to see the contrast between what they preached and what they practiced. He wanted justice that couldn't be dismissed as bitterness from a poor boy. Everything he planned had to be clean, undeniable, and irreversible. That night, back in his hotel room, he laid out documents, timelines, and names across the bed, years of research, connections. And careful planning stared back at him. This wasn't a sudden decision. It was the result of patience. He thought of his parents, especially his father, who had passed away without ever clearing his name. His chest tightened, but he didn't let grief weaken him. He promised himself that what he was about to do would honor them not with noise, but with truth. As he turned off the lights and stared at the ceiling, one thought echoed clearly in his mind. The rich family believed they had won years ago. They believed the story had ended, but stories had a way of returning, especially when the person who once had nothing came back with everything they never expected. He arrived back in the city quietly, without announcements or expensive cars, dressed in simple clothes that didn't reveal what he had become. The streets were louder than he remembered, crowded with people who had no idea who he was or what this place meant to him. Every corner triggered a memory from his childhood: the cracked sidewalks where he once walked barefoot, the bus stop where his mother waited for work that barely paid enough, and the towering mansion on the hill that still dominated the skyline like a reminder of humiliation. He didn't look at it directly at first, but he felt its presence, heavy and unavoidable, just like the past. Years ago, this city had taught him a cruel lesson about power and pride. He remembered the day his father had swallowed his dignity and walked into that rich family's estate, asking for help during the worst financial crisis of their lives. He had been just a teenager then, standing behind his parents, watching the smiles fade into cold judgment. The words spoken that day still echoed in his mind, not just rejection, but mockery. They hadn't just said no, they had made sure his family felt small, invisible, and worthless. That moment had burned something deep inside him, something that never truly healed. Now, walking these same streets as a grown man, he wasn't fueled by anger alone anymore. There was something heavier guiding him: control. He had spent years building himself from nothing, working through nights, failing, learning, and refusing to give up when it would have been easier to disappear. No one here knew that the quiet man checking into a modest hotel downtown owned companies that operated far beyond this city. No one knew he had influence, resources, and patience, three things his younger self had never had. He started by observing, not confronting. He visited local businesses, blending in, listening. He learned that the rich family still controlled much of the town's economy. Their name was respected, feared, and praised in equal measure. People spoke about them like they were untouchable, just as they had years ago. Hearing that didn't make his blood boil the way it once did. Instead, it sharpened his focus. Power, he had learned, wasn't loud. It moved quietly and struck when least expected. He also learned something else: time had not been kind to everyone. The rich family's empire looked strong from the outside, but beneath the surface, cracks were forming, internal conflicts, risky investments, and arrogance had slowly weakened what once seemed invincible. Information like this didn't excite him, it confirmed what he already believed. No empire built on humiliation and greed lasts forever. One evening, he stood across the street from the old neighborhood where he grew up. The house was gone now, replaced by a small apartment building. But he could still picture his mother standing in the doorway. Pretending everything would be okay, he closed his eyes for a moment. Steadying himself, this wasn't about revenge fueled by rage anymore, it was about dignity. It was about showing the world and himself that humiliation doesn't define the end of a story. He began making quiet moves. Investments were made through third parties. Local projects suddenly received funding. Businesses that had been ignored for years found support. And growth. Slowly, the city began to shift. Though most people didn't realize why, opportunities appeared where there had once been dead ends. Jobs were created. Hope returned in subtle ways. People started talking about a new force in the city, someone changing things from the shadows. And all the while, the rich family remained unaware that the same boy they had once looked down on was now standing at the center of a growing transformation. He watched them from a distance. Not with hatred, but with clarity. He understood now that true power wasn't about humiliating others, it was about rising so high that the past could no longer hurt you, even as it shaped everything you became. This was only the beginning. The city hadn't noticed yet. But the balance was shifting. The poor were no longer invisible. And the powerful were no longer untouchable. And when the time came for the truth to surface, it wouldn't arrive with anger or noise, it would arrive with consequences no one could ignore. He arrived back in town on a quiet afternoon, not with noise or announcement, but with a calm confidence that came from years of struggle. The town looked the same on the surface-wide streets. Clean sidewalks, expensive homes, but beneath it all, the same old attitudes lingered. People still remembered the poor family that had once lived on the edge of town, the family that had been mocked, ignored, and humiliated by those who believed money made them superior. What they didn't realize was that the son they had laughed at had been watching, learning, and building a life far beyond their imagination. As he walked past familiar places, memories surfaced uninvited. He remembered standing beside his father in a crowded marketplace, watching wealthy men laugh when his father tried to negotiate fair prices. He remembered the night his mother cried quietly in the kitchen after being publicly insulted at a charity event meant only for the rich. Those moments had carved deep lines in his heart, but instead of breaking him, they had sharpened his resolve. He had promised himself back then that one day he would return not for revenge, but for dignity. Now that promise was finally unfolding. He had built a successful business in another city, starting with nothing but long nights, rejection letters, and endless self-doubt. Every failure had taught him something valuable. Every success had been earned the hard way. And now he stood here not as the poor boy they remembered, but as a man with power, influence, and purpose. Still, he kept his identity quiet. He wanted the truth to reveal itself naturally. Without force, the rich family that once humiliated his own was hosting a large community event. Something they did often to display their status. Invitations were selective, and appearances mattered more than intentions. This time, however, he attended as a guest under the banner of a new investment firm, one that had recently gained national attention. When he walked into the hall, dressed simply but confidently, no one recognized him. They saw only a well-mannered businessman, unaware of the history standing right in front of them. Conversations filled the room, polite laughter, shallow compliments, and quiet competition disguised as kindness. He listened more than he spoke, observing how little had changed. The same family still looked down on service staff, still measured worth by wealth, still believed they were untouchable, yet beneath their confidence, he noticed something else: fear. The town was changing. New businesses, new leadership, and new values were slowly replacing the old hierarchy. and unknowingly, he was part of that change as the evening progressed. The host of the event proudly announced a major partnership that would shape the future of the town's economy. That was the moment he stepped forward. Calmly, clearly, he introduced himself not with arrogance, but with truth. He spoke about growth, fairness, and opportunity. Then, without raising his voice, he revealed his full name. The room fell silent. Faces shifted. Some whispered. Others stared in disbelief. They remembered him then, the poor boy, the son of the family they had once humiliated. The realization hit them harder than anger ever could. The same people who had dismissed his family were now standing before someone who held real influence over their future. Yet he did not humiliate them in return. Instead, he spoke about respect, about how true wealth wasn't money but character, and how power meant responsibility. His words carried weight because they were lived, not performed. That night marked a turning point for the town. The rich family lost more than status. They lost the illusion that money placed them above others. And the son, who had once walked away with nothing, finally stood tall, not to prove them wrong, but to prove that dignity, once taken, could be reclaimed, and for the first time. The town understood what they had missed all along. The day the truth began to surface was not dramatic at first. It didn't come with shouting or sudden revelations. It arrived quietly, like a crack in a wall that had been standing for years. Unnoticed until it started spreading, the rich family's world, built on status, pride, and carefully guarded lies, began to feel unstable. Subtle changes appeared: whispers during business meetings, hesitant glances at charity events, and an unspoken tension that even their closest friends could sense. The son watched all of this from a distance. He had learned patience the hard way. Years of poverty had taught him that revenge rushed was revenge wasted. He didn't want them embarrassed for a moment. He wanted them exposed forever. So he moved carefully, placing truths where lies once lived, allowing consequences to unfold naturally. He met former employees who had been silenced, neighbors who had been threatened, and families who had been crushed under unfair contracts. Each story was another piece of a puzzle the rich family had spent decades hiding. One evening, a local journalist received an anonymous folder. Inside were documents, recordings, and signed statements, nothing illegal on its own. But together they told a devastating story: how wealth had been used as a weapon, how the poor had been mocked, dismissed, and erased. The journalist hesitated at first, knowing the power of the family involved, but something about the evidence felt undeniable. The story wasn't about money anymore, it was about dignity. As the article began circulating quietly online, reactions were slow but intense. Some dismissed it as jealousy, others recognized patterns they had experienced themselves. The family patriarch laughed it off in public, calling it fabricated nonsense, but behind closed doors his confidence cracked. He knew some of the details were too accurate to be coincidence. Someone close, or someone wronged deeply, had returned. The mother felt it first. She started losing sleep, replaying moments she had once shrugged off: cruel comments, public humiliations, the day a poor woman had begged outside their gate and been chased away like an animal. For years she had told herself it was necessary, that power required distance. Now those memories refused to stay buried. She saw them everywhere, even in her reflection. The son continued his work quietly. He funded legal aid for families the rich company had displaced, anonymously at first. He supported education programs in neighborhoods his own family had once been too ashamed to enter. People began talking not about revenge, but about change. The narrative shifted. This wasn't a rich family being attacked, this was a rich family being revealed. A town hall meeting was announced to address community concerns. The rich family attended, confident they could control the room as they always had. But this time, the room felt different. The faces were no longer impressed. They were tired, one by one. People stood up and spoke not angrily, but truthfully. They talked about being laughed at, ignored, pushed aside. They didn't ask for money. They asked for acknowledgement. The son stood in the back, unnoticed, listening. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence was already shaping the moment when the meeting ended. Nothing was resolved officially, but something irreversible had happened. The family had lost control of the story. That night, the patriarch confronted his wife. "This feels personal," he said. To personal, she didn't answer right away, for the first time in years. She allowed herself to wonder if their past had finally caught up with them. The possibility frightened her more than any lawsuit ever could. The son visited his old neighborhood alone. The streets were quieter now, the buildings older, but the memories were loud. He remembered his mother's tired smile, his father's bowed head. The humiliation they endured at the hands of people who thought wealth made them superior. He realized something unexpected. His anger had changed. It was no longer burning. It was steady, controlled, and purposeful. When the second article dropped, it carried a different tone. This one focused on impact, not accusation. Names were not dragged through the mud. Facts were laid bare. The public response was overwhelming. Sponsors pulled back. Invitations stopped arriving. The family's influence, once unquestionable, began to shrink. The patriarch finally did what he had avoided for years. He looked inward. Not publicly, not apologetically, but honestly, and what he saw terrified him. He saw a legacy built on fear instead of respect, wealth without empathy, power without responsibility, for the first time. He understood that humiliation had consequences far beyond a single moment. The son prepared for the final step, not knowing exactly how it would end. He didn't want forgiveness. He didn't need applause. What he wanted was balance. A reminder to everyone watching that dignity is not something money can buy or destroy. As the town adjusted to its new reality, one truth became undeniable. The poor family that had once been crushed had not returned begging. They had returned transformed, and the rich family, for all their money, had never been so exposed. He returned to the city quietly, without announcements, without anger on his face, and without anyone recognizing the boy they once mocked. The skyline looked the same, tall glass buildings reflecting wealth and power, but to him it felt smaller now. Years ago, this city had swallowed his family's dignity whole. Today, he walked through it with calm purpose, carrying lessons learned the hard way. He rented a modest apartment near the industrial district, close enough to observe the businesses that had once crushed his father's livelihood. He didn't rush. He watched. He listened. He learned how influence truly worked here, every morning. He followed a strict routine. He woke before sunrise, ran through empty streets, and spent hours reviewing documents, contracts, and market data. During his years away, he had studied finance, law, and negotiation, not out of ambition, but necessity. Poverty had taught him discipline. Humiliation had taught him patience. He remembered how the rich family's son had laughed while security pushed his father out of their office, how people had pretended not to see. Those memories didn't burn anymore, they sharpened him. Slowly, he began making connections. Not with the elite, but with overlooked people, the small suppliers, the junior executives, the people who knew where the cracks were, but had no power to speak. He listened to their frustrations, their stories of being discarded once they were no longer useful. He never revealed his past. To them, he was just another quiet investor with thoughtful questions and a strange ability to see opportunities others ignored. Trust built naturally, without force. Within months, his influence began to grow. He invested in struggling businesses that the wealthy families had written off as failures. He restructured them patiently. Focusing on people instead of prestige, workers were treated with respect, paid fairly. And given stability, productivity rose, profits followed, his name started appearing in financial reports, whispered in meetings, never shouted. The rich family noticed the shift before they noticed him. Market shares they once dominated began slipping. Longtime partners suddenly renegotiated contracts. Confidence quietly turned into concern. One evening, he received an invitation to a charity gala hosted by the same rich family that had humiliated his own years ago. The irony wasn't lost on him. He almost declined, but then accepted. Knowing the moment had finally come, not for revenge, but for truth, he arrived dressed simply, confidently, blending into the crowd of polished suits and forced smiles. When the patriarch of the family saw his name on the guest list, confusion crossed his face, followed by a flicker of recognition he couldn't place. They spoke briefly, politely, exchanging shallow compliments. The old man had no idea who stood before him, only that this young man now held influence he couldn't ignore. As the night went on, conversations shifted, deals were discussed, numbers were mentioned, and slowly, unmistakably, the power dynamic changed. The rich family realized that many of their recent losses traced back to the same quiet figure standing calmly across the room. Later that night, alone on the balcony overlooking the city, the son thought of his father. He imagined how different things might have been if kindness had been shown instead of cruelty. He didn't feel satisfaction in watching them struggle. What he felt was clarity. Wealth without empathy was fragile. Power built on humiliation never lasted. He hadn't returned to destroy them, but to prove something far more unsettling: that dignity could survive anything, and that the poor boy they once laughed at no longer needed their approval. As the city lights flickered below, he turned away from the gala and walked back inside, knowing his journey wasn't over yet. The story wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about balance. About showing a world obsessed with status that real strength came from resilience, restraint, and remembering who you were when you had nothing at all. The town didn't return to normal overnight. People talked quietly at first, then openly about what they had witnessed. The rich family that once stood above everyone else now lived with lowered eyes, their power reduced to memories and regret. The poor families who had been ignored for years didn't celebrate loudly, they simply stood taller. Respect had finally shifted, not because of money, but because truth had surfaced. The son didn't stay in the spotlight. After revealing everything, he quietly stepped back. He refused interviews, declined public praise, and avoided attention. He had never come back to be admired. He had come back to correct a wrong that had haunted his family for generations. Justice, to him, was never about humiliation, it was about balance. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the same streets where his parents were once mocked, he stood beside his mother. She looked at him with eyes full of pride and pain, knowing that her sacrifices had not been in vain. For the first time in her life, she felt seen not as someone poor, but as someone strong. She held his hand and whispered that she could finally breathe. The rich family, on the other hand, was left with silence. They learned too late that power built on arrogance eventually collapses. Their wealth hadn't disappeared, but their influence had. Doors that once opened instantly now remained closed. And in that quiet punishment, they understood something they had never learned before: money cannot erase shame, and status cannot buy respect. The son eventually left the town again, not as a broken boy this time, but as a man at peace. He carried no hatred with him, only closure. The town would remember his return for years, not as an act of revenge, but as a reminder. Kindness ignored can return as strength, and cruelty often waits patiently for consequences. Because in the end, life has a way of circling back. The people you step on while climbing may one day be standing above you, not seeking revenge, but holding the truth. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you that dignity matters more than wealth, and that silence does not mean weakness, then take a moment to support this channel. Subscribe for more powerful, emotional stories that reflect real human struggles and life lessons. Turn on the bell icon so you never miss a story that might change the way you see the world. Thank you for listening. Your support helps these stories reach those who need them most.